Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you again for joining us for another episode of How to Bible. Start your day off right with us, How to Bible podcast. We discuss everything from parenting to end times eschatology, events, and everything in between. Join us as we walk in grace and learn in love. Last night, I was sitting around and I was trying to figure out what it is I wanted to share with you this morning. And, you're peeling through a lot of the news headlines and a lot of the things that are going on in the world, and it was pretty evident to me what it is that I thought I needed to share today with you. One of the things that I think Christians and human beings in general really struggle with is the aspect of suffering. What does it mean to suffer, and why is suffering part of God's plan? Why is suffering necessary in the scheme of things? So I wanted to take a look at that and see what Scripture said and see what it is that we could glean from the very simple act of suffering. So the devotional part of this is going to be today. It's going to take place in the book of James. We're going to be in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Ready? Here we go. James 2, or 1, chapter 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its effects, and you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That's one of the translations here. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the NIV's translation of it. That was the ESV. Sometimes they word things a little different. Here we go, the ESV. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. So it would appear like God's plan for suffering in our lives is really centered around the completion and the maturity of a Christian. Now, that being said, I don't want to make light of anyone's suffering. I don't want to make light or treat it trite or trivially. Suffering is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's something that we will all experience in our lives, no matter what, no matter walk of life, faith, or whatever. You will experience some level, some measure of suffering within yourselves. And it's never to be minimized. It's never to be discounted. We should never compare our suffering with another human being and say, oh, that's not that bad, or hey, that's not a big deal, maybe you should just grow up, or anything like that. Some years ago, I had a girlfriend, and we had just recently broken up, and she chronically would get sick. Every year she'd get bronchitis or some severe upper respiratory infection, and it was just every year. And, every year she'd go to the doctor, they'd prescribe her the medication that she needed, and, she'd take it for several weeks and, fight through it, and then eventually she would feel better, and the respiratory infection would clear. It would be just kind of the annual thing. Well, one year she was at home with her family, staying the night at her parents' place, and away from her place that she was living for college, and she died in her sleep. Her dad ended up coming in and finding her, and she was deceased. She had been dead for a while. And they took her and they performed all the necessary post-mortem things that they do to determine what the sickness was or what happened that took her life. She was young. She was 20, I believe, at the time. And it was really a really difficult time for myself, as well, obviously, or more so for the family, I imagine. But it's important to understand that suffering is going to be an aspect of our lives. Upon the autopsy, they found that she had scar tissue within her heart that must have given way or contributed somehow to her health, and it just the sickness, the disease, the scar tissue found a weak point in her immune system while she was sleeping with this upper respiratory infection, and she passed away in her sleep. So that was very very difficult. That was one of the more difficult tragedies in my life, as well as in her family's life. And this is something that I've had to face, something that I've had to deal with as well over time in my life. It also has become a very powerful part of my testimony, testifying to the fact that I've been someplace where something has been really tragic and really hard to deal with, and leaned into the Lord, excuse me, to persevere through this circumstance, through what was going on. And I remember during that process of experiencing the sickness and the death of this individual and her purpose in my life, and I remember hearing other people after about a year start saying, you need to move on, you need to get over it. And in my mind I was like, why is this something I need to just get over? And how is it that people can just get over things, like suddenly make up their mind and be like, well, I guess I'm just done suffering, and then just putting the nail in the coffin, so to speak, on that situation in your life? It never made sense to me why people would say that to another human being when they're struggling with something so severe as the loss of a loved one, or sickness, or cancer, or whatever, illness, disease. And I think that's something, especially as Christians, we need to be paying attention to. Like, people are suffering. When you go out today and you go to the grocery store, or when you walk into the supermarket, or when you go to work, people have things going on in their lives. Every human being out there has got something going on. Something's happening to them. Some situation that's pleasant or unpleasant, something is happening. And as believers, we need to be cognizant, and we need to be sensitive to other human beings that we interact with, and allow ourselves to be moved by God to pray for them and to help them out. So I printed out a couple of articles here about suffering. Some of these are really fantastic. As we know, obviously, from our devotional aspect of this, the purpose of suffering, if you're curious and you want to know and you've asked yourself this question all your life, here, we're going to answer it, all right? The purpose of suffering is to challenge your perseverance, to grow your perseverance, so that when perseverance is finished, when it's done, when perseverance is complete, you will be a mature, complete individual. Okay, so it would seem that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. So the trials that come into your life, the situations you face, you need to face them so that you can grow up in your faith and become a stronger believer in Jesus Christ. Now, those of us who avoid suffering, those of us who fight suffering and try to get away from it, we don't grow up in our faith. We don't become mature. We don't move forward, and therefore we begin to fall apart when God starts adding these other circumstances to our lives. So think of your life as an egg carton. All right, let's 12 egg carton, empty spots. Every life lesson that you learn from the Lord, every aspect that contributes to the development of your character, is an egg that is placed within that carton. Okay, over the course of time, you'll add perseverance, you'll add strength and character, you'll add integrity, you'll add honor, you'll add devotion, you'll add these things to your life. Or if you want to keep it within the Christian worldview, these would be the fruits of the Spirit: the joy, peace, patience, long-suffering. These things are added to your life through situations that you experience, where you learn and cultivate them. So in ministry, we always joke about how we say, Lord, we don't pray for patience, right? Don't ever pray for patience, because God gives you an opportunity to exercise patience, to develop it. So it gets to be difficult. And we especially don't pray for that in youth ministry or children's ministry, because God is really going to throw the curveball at you and get some wild, crazy situations where your senior pastor is going to look at you and be like, good luck, and that's it. So you want to make sure that you're praying for the right things. You want to make sure that we're asking the Lord to help us cultivate and develop these characteristics, and not just be given to us. God is not a genie. He doesn't just snap his fingers and then suddenly you're just given what it is that you need for the situation. And think about it this way. So if you have kids, when you give your kids stuff, you want to give them everything, but at some point they have to work for it. They have to earn it. When things are just given to people, what happens? They don't value it, right? There's no value placed upon what it is that has just been given to them. The value comes when you've learned to cultivate, when you've learned to develop, where you've learned to build and earned whatever that was, which is why I think we have a lot of the issues we have today with people call it the millennial generation, where they just want everything given to them. This is where the whole socialism is starting to move into our culture. One guy sarcastically said the reason why it's this way is because everybody got a finisher trophy or finisher medal, a participation medal. Everybody won something, so there's no value in actually winning and challenging and competing for the status quo. And I think to a degree that's probably true. I also think that it's a lack of discipline. Our parents never taught us the value of hard work, the value of discipline in our lives, and the daily discipline to move forward and really earn what it is that we need in life, and therefore we value it so much more. So there's an article here from Desiring God. Desiring God is a publication that was started by Pastor John Piper. I believe that he was a pastor of a church in Minnesota for many years. He travels now and does a lot of speaking. He's written several books. He's a fantastic pastor. He comes out of a Calvinism background. Don't hold it against him. He's a great pastor and a great preacher. Amazing. So he writes these articles about suffering. So here's one of the things that I want us to understand. The very first point of this, okay? Suffering is not a punishment, okay? It's not a punishment. Sometimes we think that, I have cancer. God is obviously punishing me for something I have done. In fact, when you look at the book of Job, if you haven't read that account of Job, read it. Read the factual account of Job and his life. And you'll see that his friends come to console him during his time, and one of them speaks up and says, dude, you've got sin in your life somewhere. And when you read the account, you're reading it as an outside person looking in, and you realize that is not the reason why Job was tested. That is not the reason why Job suffered. Job suffered because he was counted worthy to suffer. There was this conversation that happened between the devil and God, who comes into his presence and says, and God says to Satan and says, have you considered my servant Job? And then lists the accolades to Job, how righteous he is, how good he is, how much of an amazing heart he is. And then the devil replies to him, like, you've given him everything. He has no reason to be spiteful or angry of you. So God removes his hedge of protection from Job and says, do whatever you want, just don't touch the man. So the devil goes and just eliminates everything in Job's life. Takes his family, takes his kids. It all happens at once. And Job gets notified all at once of this stuff too. The second wave of this is that God allows the devil to touch Job's body. So Job is covered head to toe with sores, and he's sitting in this ash pile, and he's scratching the sores on his body with pieces of broken pottery. And his wife chimes in and says, why don't you just curse God and die? And he says to his wife, you speak like a foolish woman. And I have it written on my arm here. I don't know if you can see it on the video feed. It says, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? And it's so true. We need to accept the good things from God as well as the adversarial things that come from the throne that are going to afflict. So suffering is not a punishment. I'll read some of this article here real quick. Even though I know these truths, I have often been discouraged that others have been rescued while I am still suffering. Prosperity gospel proponents have told me that if I have prayed in faith, my body would be healed. My son would have been spared. My marriage would have been restored. It's all up to me. If I just have the faith, I would have a better outcome. Now he's talking about growing up in a faith, how bad theology ruins situations, how bad theology ruins your life. So the theology here is that the prosperity gospel says God wants you healthy, he wants you wealthy, he wants you wise, like this is your best life right now. And we know one pastor, I'm not going to say what his name is, but we know who he is. He's a prosperity gospel pastor. He's huge. He has one of the biggest churches here in the United States. And he pushes and propagates this healthy, wealthy, wise, best life now kind of thing. And if you look at the examples in Scripture, if you look at the examples within the Bible, because that's what we're supposed to be striving for, is what the examples are within the context of what God has given us as a archetypal individual follow. You look at Jesus, or you look at the disciples, or you look at anyone that's followed God within the Bible, and you see that healthy, wealthy, and best life now are really not within God's plan. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't want you healthy. That doesn't mean that God won't make you wealthy in the sense that you'll have a great deal of money. It doesn't mean that at all. God definitely hands out those blessings to individuals. He hands them out to individuals who can, in fact, be good stewards of those things. So somebody who understands that wealth is not going to control them, that they have given so much and they continue to give to the church and give to the needy and use that money as what it is, a tool to further the kingdom. So suffering is not a punishment. It's not something, God didn't look at you and say, okay, guess what, it's your turn, and point his sovereign hand at you and say, okay, it's time for you to suffer. No, he knows that there are parts of our life that need to be developed and cultivated. So here's another aspect of it. It says, why did God save Peter? In considering the question of when and why God chooses to rescue, I was reminded of Acts 12, which begins, quote, about that time Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. So, Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. This is Acts 12, verses 1 through 3 and 5. Peter then rescued the very night that Herod was about to bring him out to presumably kill him as he had killed James. So why did God kill James and rescue Peter? Peter, James, and John were the three of Jesus' closest disciples. That was his core. These were his inner circle, if you will. These three were often selected to be alone with Jesus, yet their earthly lives after Christ's resurrection were markedly different. John was the last disciple to die. Peter was rescued from prison in Acts 12, but church history records that he was later martyred by being crucified upside down. James was the first disciple to be martyred. The Bible records that Herod killed James with no elaborate details. We simply know that Peter was spared while James was not. What are we to do, and what are we to make of this? Did God love Peter more? Was James' life less important? Did God have less faith? Okay, so here's a situation where you have two individuals. It would seem like they're on equal playing field, equal standing of God, both part of his inner circle. Yet one was killed with no real detail, just outrightly killed, and yet Peter was jailed and held for a while, and then was presumably going to be executed by Herod. So what's the difference? It's God's plan. I know that's almost like a cheap kind of cavalier way to just say, that's just, it's up to him. But remember, the secret things belong to God. They don't belong to us. Okay, the secret things of God belong to him. His plan, his decision, his decisive nature, the reason why he does what he does is up to him. And it is as unique, his plan is as unique as the individuals are that are of the plan. So his plan for my life is radically different than the plan for your life. If you want to be happy, if you want to be content, you have to learn how to not compare yourself with anyone else. Your faith, your walk, what God has got you doing is going to be different than everyone else. And what makes that so great is that the reason why people like Pastor Greg Laurie or Pastor John Piper or Pastor Joshua Perlman, the reason why they like them is because they are uniquely their own. They are their own. If everyone was like one of these three pastors, it would be really lame because we'd only have three different types to choose from, three different personalities, three different aspects of knowledge and individuality, and it would be really lame. It would be super lame. But God has made His plan unique, and it's tailored to each one of us. He's got a plan for your life. I mean, that's amazing. God has got a specific plan for your life, and that is something that I think is awesome, because I love knowing that whatever God is doing in my life is going to be not only unique, but it's also going to be tailored to my strengths and to what it is I'm good at, the things that God has put in my life, the giftings that He has given me. Those are things that you can look forward to. Those are things that are part of God's unique plan. So suffering is all unique. Here's another article by Pastor John Piper. It says, the second thing I would say is that it's almost too obvious to need to say anything, but if you don't give, is that you don't give the impression that you have been through this yourselves and can emphasize, even if you have suffered much. All suffering is unique, absolutely unique. There are things about it that no one else has tasted in the very same way. Therefore, the comfort we give should not include statements about our own suffering and our own capacity to empathize. Quote, I know what you're going through, or something along those lines. We don't understand. Look, we had friends of ours that lost one of their children to cancer. I can't sit there and look at him and be like, I understand what you're going through. Because I don't get it. I don't understand the visceral pain of losing a child. I mean, I think about that a lot because I have kids. I think about the loss of one of my babies, and I will not experience that. However, okay, let me just throw this in here too real quick. Just because you cannot personally identify with somebody else's pain does not mean that you should not be present to comfort them. You can sit with them and be a listening ear. You can offer tactile responses. Put your hand on their shoulder. Let them know that you're present and available. These are all things that we can do as believers to bear and share each other's burdens. We are supposed to share one another's burdens. Pastor Francis Chan would say you're supposed to one another. You have to be available to lift the other person up, to be present in their life. God commands us to share each other's burdens, and just because you haven't identified with the pain doesn't mean that you cannot and should not do that. In fact, it's a command that you are supposed to be there anyway, to weep with those who weep, to mourn with those who mourn, to laugh with those who laugh. That's a command from God. Keep praying. I would say don't give up on praying patiently for the relief and healing. Sometimes we just settle in with sickness and we've prayed so long that we've given up on hoping for healing unless you get a pretty clear word from the Lord about it. Don't give up. Do not give up. You are never out of the fight. You are always in the fight. Don't give up on your prayers. Keep praying. Jesus talked about the persistent widow in let me see if I can pull it up here real quick. I wish my brain functioned in a way where I could, plan out everything I was going to say, and it just doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, everyone else suffers. I'm like, oh yeah, this is great, but everyone else suffers, and I'm like, oh, let's do this. I'm so off the hinges here. So the persistent widow is a parable that Jesus told to his disciples about prayer, about making sure that we're praying and ensuring that we're praying. And you can find that. Well, I guess if I say persistent widow, not persistent windows. Widow. Sorry. Don't mind me. This is public education here working itself out. Persistent widow. Oh, apparently you can find a persistent widow dating site on here. I think it's kind of odd. Persistent widows dating online. You gotta be careful sometimes on what it is that you're Googling. Go to Luke 18, and we're gonna be in verses 1 through 8. I'm gonna go ahead and pull this up in my Bible so that I don't find any more persistent widow dating sites here. My wife could be like, what are you doing? So Luke 18, we're gonna be in Luke chapter 18. It's gonna be verse 1 through 8. Here we go. One day Jesus told his disciples a story to show that they should always pray and never give up. Okay, so the reason for this parable is already given. He said he shared this with them so that they would know to pray and never give up. Excuse me. There was a judge in a certain city, he said, Jesus, who neither feared God nor cared about people. The widow of that city came to him repeatedly saying, give me justice in this dispute with my enemy. The judge ignored her for a while, but finally he said to himself, I don't fear God or care about people, but this woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice because she is wearing me out with her constant requests. And then it says, the Lord said, learn a lesson from this unjust judge. All right, so Jesus says, look, pray. Don't stop praying. Be persistent in prayer. Pull on the throne. Tug on the throne. Knock on the door, and it will be open to you. God needs us to be persistent. Okay? He wants us to be persistent, not because it's the only way he'll respond, but because there's something in being persistent that is necessary for our development. So God will give us situations where we need to be persistent, continually persistent, constantly praying. So this is one of those opportunities when you're suffering to continually be persistent. So the last thing I really want to cover real quick, like I said, I want to cover some eschatology stuff during each one of our podcasts, just so we can be encouraged that there are things coming from God. His plan is moving forward. Redemption for our bodies is near. Jesus is on his way. He's going to redeem us. He's going to buy us back from sin and this wretched flesh that's just decaying. So as you know, if you've been watching the headlines, there was a Muslim extremist group in Africa, in Nigeria, that has slaughtered tens of hundreds of Christians over the last month or so. I'm going to pull it up on my computer here again. Maybe I won't get any dating sites for this, right? Nigerian Christians murdered. Here we go. So the record is that 120 Christians in Nigeria were killed over a 3-week period. Again, this is the Boko Haram Islamic group that's running around killing Christians. Here's a CBN article. It says that 300 were killed. And I think we're still getting total counts for the death toll and everything that's going on. It says 2 Islamic groups target Nigerian Christians. 300 killed, while 72 others are supernaturally saved from firing spots. That's an article I haven't read yet, so I'm not going to try to read it right now. But I also want to make sure that things are true and they're factual, so I went ahead and checked Snopes too to see if there was any information here, anything in here that would be spun, because I know there's spin in Christianity, there's spin in the world. Sometimes when we report things, we want to make them more dramatic or whatever people do, whatever their reasons are for spinning things out of control. So it said there's a mixture of truth and, according to Snopes, there's a mixture of truth and lie. It says, what's true? Although not entirely reliable, various local news reports corroborated the incidents and deaths described by Breitbart and the Christian Post website. Okay, so I'm not sure what Snopes' political leaning is, if it's anti-Christian or if it's neutral or what. But some of the way they word things within their actual article and their statement is kind of, I don't know, it makes me feel like they're a little more left-leaning than they are conservative. It says false here. It says the section that's actually false, they say, is the religious affiliations is a secondary issue in the ongoing Nigeria herder-farmer conflict. I don't necessarily agree with that. Excuse me. If you've ever read the Quran or listened to anything in the Hadith, you'll see that there is a command and a charge for the Muslim, the genuine believing Muslim, to go out and lay waste to the infidel. Now that's not just Christian, that's not just Jew. There is a specific and special place for them, but it's anyone. There was I want to say it's the Battle of Tours in France, that actually halted the expansion of Islam in Europe. During that battle, it was pivotal. They shut down the Muslim armies from conquering Europe, which is why Christianity ended up being the dominant religion within Europe. That all hinged on the Battle of Tours. You can look that up. It's really interesting. But it's saying here that the religious affiliation for these Christians that are suffering in Nigeria is actually a secondary thing. And I'm not a person to believe that. I believe that if you're part of Boko Haram, if you are part of a radical Islamic culture, the primary reason for you to do what it is you're doing is the verse of the sword. Okay? It's either Muhammad or death. That's what's going on. That's what's happening with the Middle East. We have to call the target and call it as it is, instead of trying to paint it in this neutral, non-religious spin, so that we can just say, oh, these are just bad people. Well, yeah, they're bad people, but they're also subscribing to an ideology that is not just religiously based, but it is completely based and woven and stitched into the fabric of their life. It is their identity. It is everything about them. Islam is spidered into every aspect of a Muslim's life, whether that be his social interactions with his wife and his children, his faith interactions with the community, the way he runs his business, the way he handles infidels. All of this is spidered into every part of his life. Therefore, you cannot separate the faith from the individual. They are interwoven so much so that they are unable to be removed or separated from each other. There's no way to do it. So when we see things like this, Muslim extremist group kills, articles like this want to say, no, it's about land use. No, it's not. It's about Islam. It's about differing faith. It wouldn't matter if it was a Christian group or if it was a village full of witch doctors. The extremists would have came in and done the same thing. There's just spin here because of the religious affiliation and the contention between the two faiths. God is on the move, brothers and sisters. He is working in our lives. If you're an individual who is suffering, or if you know someone that is in fact suffering, here are some great tips for you. 1, remember that suffering is not a punishment. You're not being punished by God. You're given an opportunity to grow in your perseverance so that you may become mature and complete. All right, that is the reason for suffering. That is the purpose for it in your life, so that you grow. So hurry up and grow so the suffering can end. Move forward. Again, I don't want to treat it cavalierly. I just want to state the facts and move on. If you're suffering, suffer well, suffer right, suffer faithfully for God and for His purposes, and I assure you that He will come through. The next big thing, like I said, number 1 is suffering is not punishment. 2, this is the thing that really helps me when I'm struggling, when I'm fighting through something, a sickness in my family or within myself. As a Christian, this is the only time you will ever be able to suffer. After this life, you will not suffer ever again. You will never taste suffering. You will never taste pain. You will never shed another tear of sorrow. There will be no more mourning, no more sickness, no more death. This is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is the only time you're going to suffer. So here's the deal. How many times have we kept our mouth shut about something? When somebody said something and we kept our mouth shut, and later on we're like, man, I should have said this or should have done that. We live with that regret in our mind. Look, live with the end in mind. Live today with the end in mind. The end is this: you will never suffer again. Suffer well during this time. Magnify God and show how amazing and how sovereign He is, even in your darkest hour. Spend your time wrestling with Him. God is big enough to handle your questions. He's big enough to handle your arguments. He's big enough to handle your anger. Wrestle with Him. Take Him to the mat. But remember that this is the only time you're ever going to suffer. Right now, these short 20, 30, 40, 60, 80, 100 years of your life, this is it. And in the end, when you're in heaven and you're seated there with God and you're looking back on your life over the next 2,000 years, you want to be able to say, man, I did that perfect. I did it so well. I'm so proud of the way that I handled that. And the Lord will say the same thing to you. Well done, good and faithful servant. Well done. So for the glory of the Lord and the hope of the nations, brothers and sisters, stay the course.